Okay.
So, good afternoon to all of you, friends that I know and colleagues that I don't know. Happy to host you in another seminar of the series on theories of regulation and governance. And today with us, Marlene Jugl. Did I pronounce well?
Yeah, pretty
Correct?
good. Better
Jugl
than the
or
Italian.
Jugl? What's that?
Jugel.
Jugl. And Marlene has a new paper in J-Part on patterns of bureaucracy, conceptualizing administrative tradition. And because I'm fascinated with administrative tradition, I think it's an important topic. It's a nice puzzle. It's difficult concept. And it's also very important to keep the different traditions, right? We don't have to be the same all over the world. So happy to have her. Let me say a few words about Marlene. She's assistant professor in public administration at Bocconi University, Italy. Bocconi is in Milan. She's hold a degree from the RT school in Berlin. She did the PhD there, but she came originally from Potsdam. And then she traveled in many places in Europe. I think she was in eBay and where else, Marlene?
Yeah, so last year I was on sabbatical in eBay in Barcelona, in Tallinn,
Uh-huh.
Tallinn University of Technology, and Leiden University in the Netherlands.
Yeah, and she's still young and traveling. Her research interests include comparative public administration, country size and governance, crisis management, and administrative tradition. And she has three papers already in 2025, so it's very impressive. Visit our Scholar Google
Do
page.
I?
Marlene, the floor is yours and good luck. We are looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you very much, David. Thanks for organizing this and thanks for the kind introduction. Um, Let me share my presentation again, which is here. Yeah, now you should be able to see it. I'll just rearrange a bit my screen. Give me a second. Okay, here I am. And I'm really happy to share this research with you. So I've just received the page proofs of the article today. So it's really very fresh. And I've worked on this quite a bit, quite some time in the last year, especially during my sabbatical. And I'm really excited to really finally share the output, but also perhaps ideas for future research. So since you're here, you probably have some idea about this concept of administrative traditions that I will talk about. But just as a quick introduction, let me remind you of a few important points. So administrative traditions, or AT, as I will say short for administrative traditions here throughout the presentation, is a central concept in comparative public administration, right? It's a way to classify administrative systems across countries and to compare them. One of the most influential scholars in this literature is Guy Peters, and he defines administrative traditions as a historically based set of values, structures, and relationships with other institutions that defines the nature of appropriate public administration within a society. Perhaps you haven't seen that definition yet, but you probably have heard of some of those types or country families or simply different traditions that we talk about. So we tend to distinguish an Anglo-American tradition from a Napoleonic tradition, a Germanic tradition, etc., etc. And this concept and the different traditions, really, or country groups, are widely used in public administration and management literature. Also, I've seen some applications to regulatory agencies. But I think the most prominent application is probably to explain variation in the success of administrative reform. So we often say that administrative reforms, just like NPM, work in some contexts, but not in others. And one prominent explanation for this variation is through administrative traditions. More recently, the concept has also been used to explain variation in how governments managed the COVID crisis. I also have a paper on that if you're interested in it. And of course, there are many other applications. So this is just to remind you again or convince you that it's a central concept in the field. Now, what's not what's wrong with it, but what is perhaps missing from my point of view? So I was always fascinated by this concept, but I felt that it was not very clear. Scholars use different definitions, or they conceptualize it in very different ways. Here is just two examples, and I could have given you many more examples. But the example here you see in the top left is the book by Painter and Peters from 2010, which is also quite influential in this debate. And they conceptualize administrative traditions with 4 elements, or as I will call them, attributes. So 4 attributes of an administrative system that together in different combinations kind of define an administrative tradition. So they talk about the state tradition, or the relation between state and society, then the relationship between administration and politics, the question of law versus management, so whether public administration is more legalistic or more managerialist, and then questions of accountability mechanisms. Now, fast forward a few years, and Guy Peters, so one of the original authors, he publishes a new book on administrative traditions in 2021, and he keeps those 4 attributes, but he adds 4 new ones, or 4 additional ones, being administration and service, so the question of how service-oriented the administration is, then questions of civil service systems, careers, personnel, then the participation of social actors and citizens in policy making, and what he calls uniformity, which is basically questions of centralization, decentralization. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with these conceptualizations, but you see already here with the same author, there's a lack of consistency. And this is just one example to illustrate that there's no agreement on a definition of administrative traditions in the literature. There's no agreement on the actual conceptual dimensions or attributes that we should use to define the concept, nor an agreement on measures or how we actually cluster or classify countries. And in my reading, some reasons for this lack of agreement are due to these underlying issues that I listed here. One is that this literature focuses, I think, excessively on what I call paradigmatic cases. So there's an excessive focus on France as a paradigmatic case for the Napoleonic tradition. Then we know a lot about Germany as the example of the Germanic tradition, and then UK and US for the Anglo-American tradition. And we know far less about how traditions have developed or work in other countries that sometimes are classified in the same traditions and sometimes in others. So there's a strong focus on the description of a few cases, but not so much systematic comparison in my view. And the other underlying issue I see is that some scholars that use the term try to do 2 things at once. On the one hand, they use the administrative traditions concept kind of as a description, as a descriptive tool to describe present-day public administration or administrative systems. So what type of administrative system do we have in country A and in country B? And then the second aim that they often, or that we often as scholars try to pursue by using the term tradition, is to give some weight on to the historical origins or influences, right? So this is what I call administrative tradition more as theory. So the arguments related to path dependency and so on, that the patterns we see today are due to some important historical developments. And again, I'm not saying that anything is wrong with these aims, but I think that we should distinguish them or disentangle them analytically to get to a clearer conceptualization. And what I do in this study and in this paper is to focus on the first part. So I'm only focusing on the conceptualization of tradition as a descriptive tool of today's public administration, and I leave the historical part to, let's say, future research. So my goal in this study is, as I said, to conceptualize administrative traditions as coherent sets of these administrative attributes or characteristics of administrative systems in modern day or present day countries, basically. And I do that in 3 steps in the paper. I start with a systematic literature review to explore how the concept is used in the literature, which attributes are actually referred to in the literature. The second step then is an exploratory factor analysis. I basically operationalize some of these characteristics or attributes and use factor analysis to see if we can reduce the number of attributes to maybe one or more underlying dimensions or logics. And then in the third step, I construct and validate kind of my own measure of these administrative traditions, and I will present you a 2-dimensional index for 49 countries. And now I'll just basically walk you through these 3 steps and the results. So the first one is the systematic literature review. I follow the PRISMA approach and protocol, and I will not go through all the details here. Basically, what I did is I looked at academic publications since 1998, so around 25 years coverage. And I looked at those publications that had the search term administrative tradition, either in, the typical like title, abstract, and keywords, but I also complemented this with some search strategies that also looked for the administrative tradition or traditions in the full text. So I combined different search methods. Again, details are found in the paper, or if you're interested, I can also elaborate on that later on. Here's just a very quick summary of my search process. So again, at the top, you see I had different kind of strategies to identify the records. And then I screened them and checked them for my inclusion criteria. And at the end, I'm left with 505 publications that I included in the review. And that I went through them one by one and coded them for a number of characteristics. I coded more things that I include in this specific paper, so I hope I can perhaps work on a second paper later on. But the most important result from the review is for this paper is this one here. So what you see here, what I coded here is the attribute or the kind of the understanding of administrative traditions that each publication uses. So for each publication, I went through it and looked for the term administrative tradition, and then I did my best to interpret how the authors were understanding the term or using the term. Some authors are really explicit. They give their own definition of traditions and say, for example, an administrative tradition consists of the level of decentralization and politicization in an administrative system, for example. That would be an explicit definition, but often authors are a bit more implicit. And when they, use the concept theoretically, that's where you can actually read or find out what they mean, what terms or attributes they refer to. Or sometimes also the operationalization, if it's a quantitative study, can also tell us what the authors actually have in mind when they use this term. And many authors refer to multiple attributes. I think that's quite intuitive because we think of traditions as a multidimensional concept. So one publication can have several of these attributes here. And here you see those attributes just ordered by frequency. And the most frequent one is this question of law versus management. So whether public administration has a more legalistic or a more managerialist approach. That's followed by state tradition. So the question of ideas about the state, but also the role of the state, relationships between state and society. Then centralization, decentralization, politicization, and so on and so forth. The attributes that are marked here in dark blue are in line with Guy Peters' most recent book from 2021. So this is, let's say, in line with, we could say, the mainstream approach to to administrative traditions. The 3 attributes in this lighter blue instead are things that are not mentioned by Guy Peters, but these are attributes that emerge from the review, I would say. And the most important one is that of fragmentation and coordination. So that is my labeling, let's say. And here, what I included here are studies that use the term administrative traditions to refer to the degree of fragmentation, or how the central government especially is organized. How many ministries and agencies do we have? Is it more fragmented or more concentrated? How much and which ways of coordination do we see? So this type of understanding understanding is included here. Just very quickly, the last two bars here are shown in black, and these I think are problematic, and these represent about, I think, 120 publications that either present no explanation, not even an implicit explanation of what they mean by administrative traditions, or the second to last bar here shows those studies that say administrative tradition, then provide some citations, very often to Painter and Peters or so, but they don't really go into detail what they mean. And this is especially problematic when studies use the concept maybe as an explanatory factor. And given this variety of potential meanings and attributes that we see in the literature, again, I think it's quite problematic. You also see here just at the top right is just a quick reminder that there is, of course, a Western bias in this literature, as we would expect with most, I think with most literatures or debates in public administration and management. But here, I think what is particular is that it's really a very European debate also. So our colleagues in the US are not so interested in this concept, I think. It's quite a European discussion in my reading. So this is just, again, the main result from the review for this paper. What I do in the next step, essentially, is I take these attributes, I operationalize them for as many countries as I can find data, and then I run an exploratory factor analysis to see whether we can reduce the complexity of these many attributes to one or a few underlying factors or dimensions. So I take the first 10 attributes here. I exclude the two last ones for reasons I discuss in the paper, but I take all the first 10 attributes, and these same attributes now appear here in the first column. And then, as I said, I operationalize them. I looked for data sources that are kind of a good operationalization of these ideas, of these concepts. But also another criterion was to have a large country coverage. And I can already say that I'm happy with some of these variables, and with others I'm not so happy. So some are just very crude proxies. I definitely have to admit that. But the good news is that I found all variables, so I have the full coverage for 49 countries. And that is definitely more than the usual paradigmatic cases that we saw in the literature before. So I don't have time to go through all the operationalization here, but you see the variables, and we can elaborate on that perhaps later. Also important to note, these are the data are for around between 2015 and 2019, so fairly recent. That was my goal, but well, they're pre-COVID, we could say. So I took these variables for 49 countries and then basically ran an exploratory factor analysis, and I played a bit around with robustness checks with different specifications, but what comes out quite consistently is that there's two underlying factors. So 6 variables load on the first factor and 4 variables load on the second factor. And after the quantitative exercise, the challenge is, of course, to give meaning to these results, to come up perhaps with a label for each factor. And here is what I came up with. So I call the first factor citizen orientation. And what I mean here is that this factor captures the characteristics of a public administration system that is oriented towards what citizens want, towards citizens' needs. So strong citizen orientation means or goes together with a strong public service orientation among public managers, goes together with, we have a negative sign on politicization. So high citizen orientation means low politicization. High citizen orientation then means strong civil society consultation in policymaking and implementation. It goes together with strong horizontal accountability, so accountability of the government and the administration to parliament, courts, and other oversight bodies. Strong citizen orientation goes together with an open public personnel system and with a more managerialist outlook. So one that is oriented towards achieving results for citizens and not focusing so much on the rules. The opposite end of that factor or of that dimension is what I would call orientation towards what politicians and bureaucrats want. So the opposite end of citizen orientation would be a legalistic administration with a closed personnel system that is very politicized and not really oriented towards what citizens want. The second factor, I think, is a bit more straightforward to conceptualize. I call this structural concentration. And an administrative system with high structural concentration is one with a civil law system that tends to be more rigid and leave less room to maneuver to public administrators compared to common law system. Strong structural concentration also means a strong state, so a high public expenditure share compared to GDP, so compared to the economy, compared to society, you could say. Strong structural concentration also means a low degree of fragmentation among or between ministries and a low degree of vertical fragmentation or decentralization. Okay, so this is, let's say, the way I made sense of these results. And then the third step after the factor analysis is to come up with a way to measure citizen orientation and structural concentration for my 49 countries. So what I did is pretty simple. I just calculated two additive indices, so one for each factor. So for the first index, I standardized the data for the first 6 variables and added them up. And then the same for the second factor and index. So I have two indices to capture these two factors, and I can show them to you here. And I'm really excited about this map. So on the x-axis, you see the degree of citizen orientation with stronger citizen orientation on the right. And on the y-axis, you see the degree of structural concentration with more concentrated systems at the top. And you can also see the 49 countries that I included. And I'm really happy that it's not just the usual suspects, not just Western Europe or Western countries, but there's also countries from Latin America, from Asia here. One of the big missings are African countries. They are not included simply for reasons of data availability. So that's the only, the reason why countries do not appear here. So again, the biggest missings are countries from Africa and also countries with authoritarian governments or non-democratic governments are definitely underrepresented here. So here we can already see how those countries or where they are located basically on these two indices or these two dimensions. And to further make sense of this, I tried to theorize a bit the four corners or that are kind of theoretically pure types. So they're kind of ideal types, you could say. And in the top right corner is what I call a providing public administration that is closest to this ideal type are the Nordic countries. So here we have a public administration that is really oriented towards what citizens want. And at the same time, it's highly concentrated. So there's a strong and concentrated central government that is that we could say perhaps has really the power and the capacity to provide for the citizens and provide what they want or what they need. In the bottom right corner is what I call a liberal public administration that is equally oriented towards what citizens want, but it is much more deconcentrated structurally. So we have much more room for variation in terms of how public services are delivered and by whom. In the bottom left corner is what I call a detached public administration. It's a public administration that is also very fragmented with many ministries, agencies, levels of government, decentralized, and that revolves a lot around itself and is dominated by the wants and needs of bureaucrats and politicians. And in the top left corner, the ideal type or the pure type is what I call a dominant public administration, one that is also oriented towards what those in power want, and it is very concentrated structurally, and this is very much in line with the qualitative descriptions of cases like Hungary and Turkey that we know from the literature, where in context of democratic backsliding, government politicians or heads of government have really tried to concentrate power in the central government, to use the administration to basically enforce their will on citizens and other actors. And this is, I think, captures by this combination of low citizen orientation and high structural concentration. Okay, after I presented those measures or indices, what I do in the paper is to validate them. Here you see all the validation kind of checks and tests that I did, and I don't have time to go through all of them. So what I basically did is, first of all, in terms of criterion validity, I compared my measures to other measures or operationalizations of administrative traditions. So I compared these two-dimensional continuous measures with the usual categories or country families that we usually use to, as a measure of tradition. So there are the 9 categories that Painter and Peters introduce in their book. And there are 5 categories of legal origin based on an older paper from economists Laporte et al. That are also often used as kind of proxies for administrative traditions. I ran ANOVAs. They are significant, so there's a meaningful variation of citizen orientation and structural concentration between or along these categories that were previously used. And I think the easiest way to make sense of this check is more a visual check that you see here. So you see again the same map with the same 2 axes and dimensions with my 49 countries. But in color now are shown the country families that we usually associate these countries to based on the Painter and Peters book. So there are 9 country families. And here it's just a visual check or a plausibility check. And I think this check shows that my data do make sense or my results make sense. For example, in the bottom right in black, we see the Anglo-American countries, right? They're somewhat clustered together. But my data are more nuanced. They show that there is actually quite some variation still within this group of countries, with some being much more concentrated and some more deconcentrated, especially on this dimension. In the top right, in this beige or light brown color, we see the Nordic countries. Then, for example, in the center in orange, we see the Napoleonic countries. So they're all clustering quite well, I think. So there's meaningful variation between the groups. But in some of those families or country families, there's also a lot of variation. For example, in red, we see what we often label as post-Soviet or post-communist countries, and that stretches from Bosnia-Herzegovina here in the bottom left somewhat up to Estonia in the top right, that is much closer to the Nordic countries. But this also makes sense based on what scholars in these countries would tell us. So I think this variation that we see here is kind of a strength of my measures, right? They can capture this variation rather than assigning the same label of post-Soviet or post-communist to all countries here in red. There's also some meaningful variation, for example, among the Latin American countries in the strong blue. Okay, but I'm running out of time, so yes, it's good that I'm coming to the discussion part, so to the last 2 slides. So what I try to do here in this study is I aim for a synthesis of the administrative traditions concept, and I argue and develop the argument that we can reduce all this complexity into two underlying logics and then capture it with two indices. So I conceptualize traditions as the degree of citizen orientation and structural concentration in a country's public administration system. I argue that this conceptualization and then also the measures might be useful for a variety of applications. I think what I really aimed for is for all of us to be more careful when we use the concept. So I saw in the review that some scholars are very careful and develop really interesting and sharp theoretical arguments when they use the concept, but others use it a bit more superficially, I would say. And I hope that this article will make us a bit more careful and motivate us to make perhaps more nuanced use of the concept. So, for example, when we use traditions as an explanation, then rather than saying, "Oh, this is because a country is Napoleonic or because it is Scandinavian or whatever," let's think about what it is about the tradition that really has an effect here. Which dimension of the tradition maybe is relevant here. Other applications are for case selection, for example. So often scholars use traditions to justify case selection. Also here, I think the best practice would be to really reflect on why is it relevant to have the same or different traditions for my specific cases. And again, thinking about this as a two-dimensional concept can help us to develop better and sharper arguments here. There's a number of limitations, obviously, in this study, and I discussed them at length in the article, as all the reviewers asked me to do. There's limitations of the review, right? There was somewhat subjective choices there also made in how I set up the review and the criteria that affect the results, obviously. My paper, has a big title, but it focuses, let's say, only on the national level and only on today's public administration system. So one thing that I leave out is really this historical part, and I say I leave it to future research. And then with a focus on the national level, it's really the focus of the traditions concept. I'm leaving out other variation. I'm not saying that, administrative practice or institutions vary only from one country to another. No, there may be other important sources of variation for your specific study context. So subnational variation between organizations, between professions, and here is very much a national focus. So it's kind of this methodological nationalism, you could say. There are some limitations also in the factor analysis, and the country coverage is larger than in many other publications on traditions, but it's still limited. And I want to end with some ideas for future research. And the ideas I have in mind are really revolving around this second part of or this complementary part of what I call administrative traditions as theory. So the historical element, basically. My paper has focused a lot on describing present day administrative systems, but what's the role of history, basically? And the question that I want to ask in future research is really, when we have a good kind of description of today's patterns of bureaucracy, we could say, then which historical configurations and conditions explain these patterns and the correlation of certain attributes of administrative systems, right? Why do we see these similar combinations in some countries and other combinations in other countries, and you could say, well, path dependency, that's the answer that we see in the literature, but it's not always that well developed, I would say. And I think one way to developing to advance this is to be really focused on specific historical cases, overcoming these country families, this kind of putting a label on a group of countries and saying path dependency, but rather really focusing on the specific cases, on specific historical developments, maybe critical junctures in countries' history when certain decisions were made and those patterns were kind of developed. I think it's also important to focus on the non-paradigmatic cases. I think we know a lot about how, the administrative system developed in France and in Germany, but we know much less about other countries, and especially the hybrid cases, I think, are interesting theoretically. So some questions like I put here on the slide, for example, which historical developments explain the variation among Latin American countries that we could see on this two-dimensional map, or why and how has Estonia moved away from other post-communist countries? That's a question that I am currently tackling. So I'm doing 2 case studies, and one of them is on Estonia. And I think we have different methodological tools available. We could simply extend this mapping of those 10 attributes back in time in a more quantitative way, or we could opt for more qualitative, in-depth case studies. So really, again, looking into what specific historical cases to understand how the different attributes have developed over time, why they correlate, why we see those specific patterns that we ended up with today. And I'll stop here. I am definitely running out of time. Just want to show you this. Obviously, I'm quite happy with this. So you can already find the accepted manuscript on the journal website, and the final version should follow very soon. So I'll end here, and I really look forward to all sorts of questions, comments, discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marlene, for excellent presentation. Very interesting, and I'd like to open it the discussion for the floor for discussion, and invite you to come in. Let's just come in with your question. You don't have to raise your hand necessarily.
I would like to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I really felt the gap in the literature. So I think that your work is really very helpful for us to try to do comparative studies. So thank you for that. I was wondering regarding 2 things. First of all, have you referred to both administrative culture, not just tradition, as a term? Because I think that that's another phrase or term that is being used. And the second thing, that I always felt that when I want to use this kind of comparative analysis, that I need another layer, not just the tradition, rather than I was focusing on policy styles, for example, as a supporting term to understand the comparative aspect. Sometimes even I was figuring if the welfare regime in a more specific issue are relevant. So I felt I need to combine a theoretical perspective to really be able to compare or say something in that regard. So I was wondering if you were thinking about this kind of integration as a supporting one, or as the damaging one for understanding the terms. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll respond right away, right? Okay. These are really questions also I was grappling with and struggling with sometimes. So the first one was about, administrative traditions versus administrative culture. And that is very important, a very important question, like how do we tackle that? And what I did, for example, in my review is I only focused on one term, on the traditions. And even with that, I was left with 505 publications. So that was a lot of work already, which is not a good reason to say not to include other concepts. Of course, I encountered a lot this term of administrative culture, and a lot of scholars actually use it interchangeably, but then some others might not. And so there's definitely need also for more clarification there. So my approach as, one single scholar was to focus on one term and try to get clearer about what administrative traditions mean. And I say somewhere in the paper, okay, I'll leave the question of, how that relates to administrative cultures to future work or others. So I haven't really found a very good answer to this. Again, some people use them interchangeably. I would argue or suggest that we don't do that, so that we stick to one term. If we have a clear understanding of what administrative culture means, that's great, then we can use it. But I guess the most important thing is to be explicit about how you use or understand each of the two terms. But then again, let's say for this idea and concept that I've described, I would argue we should use the term administrative traditions. I think that is the more common one. And then if we want to use culture, we should say exactly what we mean. And especially, for example, at which level do we think of administrative culture? Is that something that is specific? There's also organizational culture, which I think is a good term because it specifies the level. It says that's organizational. Whereas administrative culture is like, where is that located and how does that relate to the traditions? I'm not entirely sure. And then the other question you have was about also other related concepts that I also, again, struggled a bit with. One is policy styles. And indeed, what I can tell you from the review is that some scholars also use the terms interchangeably, or they explicitly say, we refer to traditions, but we mean policy styles. So that is one of the meanings that emerged from the review that I saw some people use. But then also most of these people that use policy styles also as a part of traditions will say that policy styles are policy sector specific, right? And in that way, they're different from the traditions that we conceptualize really at the country level, kind of. So now to your more research practice question, so how do we use them? I think if it makes sense for your research to go for policy sector specific policy styles, then that's good. And I don't want to discourage that. It's more like, again, if that is the level that you're interested in, so maybe you have a comparison of certain policy implementation or policy tools across countries, then policy styles can be the right concept for you, I think, because it is more specific than the traditions concept. But again, the overall answer would be at least be explicit about your choices and which of these concepts you use and why. I think that would already move us all a lot forward if we were more explicit about that.
Thank you, Marlene. More questions? I see Ruth, please, and I have my own, but after Ruth, please.
Thank you. That was really interesting, and what a rich data set. That's fantastic. Yeah, actually picking up on the previous first question, and I won't make you go through the thing about culture, which was a absolutely valid answer. But when I see this two-dimensional thing, I do think about the grid group cultural theory type, and your structural dimension anyway does seem to be the rule-based, the grid side of it. I'm not completely sure, but it is something. But that would be really interesting maybe to follow up later. But no, I take your point absolutely that tradition and culture are not the same thing. I had another question, and it's just possible it came up in one of your tables, but given that all of your data comes from before COVID, I was wondering whether this might illuminate the different styles of responses to COVID across the different countries. I think that would be fascinating just to see where things map onto your grid. Anyway, thank you. Fantastic talk.
Thanks very much for the kind comments. Yes, the grid group is another, let's say, two-dimensional way of thinking about culture and about administration. So it's something like I don't have a good answer. I haven't really thought it through, but it's one illustration that two-dimensional things are kind of prominent in our field. I think we like that maybe. And it's a good suggestion to kind of follow up on that. So maybe I'll just sit down and think about how my two dimensions relate to other, concepts or dimensions that we've worked with. So the grid group one. And then, especially the structural concentration is also, it's related to also then to hire like to political institutions also. So that's something that I still have to wrap my head around. And the other question you have, I actually have a more specific answer. So to the COVID question, it's something that I skipped on the slides, but I had it there. And that's for what I did for validation was not just compare my measure to other measures of traditions, but also this next step is to use my measure and kind of relate it to potential outcomes where we would expect traditions to play a role. So I have one just simple correlation where I correlate my two measures with a measure of reform, basically, and I show that the first dimension is correlated with that reform or the use of online services. The second dimension is not. And another outcome that I look at is actually COVID governance. So here what I did in this paper is very simple bivariate correlation. So it's not a final answer. But I basically correlated, again, my two indices with the number of days that it took a government to respond with a binding measure to a COVID case. So how many days elapsed between the first domestic COVID case and the first binding measure? It's a measure that I used in my earlier COVID paper that I mentioned at the beginning. And here I find that both dimensions, this citizen orientation and structural concentration, are both somewhat correlated with this speed of crisis response, basically, but especially the second dimension. And that also resonates with my earlier study. So the more concentrated a public administration system is, right, the quicker they could respond. So the less you need to coordinate among several ministries or among central and decentral units, the quicker it was to respond to COVID. So I think, that's just a quick validity check. It's not a proper study, but it goes into the direction that you suggested, and might actually follow up with a proper study where I use my measures to and apply them in this way. So thanks.
A question from me, actually two questions or comment. One is you did a conceptual work there, not only empirical one. One of those elements of conceptual is to call one of the dimensions citizen orientation. Now I look at the component of this concept of citizen orientation, and I doubt if it's suitable and if it carries enough theoretical significance for later on, because it has effect on the way we see countries. And why citizen orientation? What are the alternatives that you considered probably during your research? This is one question. The other one is, you have few points in time, and I don't know how many in your data set. And the question is, to what extent those administrative traditions are stable on the different dimensions? So say 10 years from now or 10 years before, what would be the dynamic? And we're speaking about traditions, right? Traditions mean some kind of continuity, and you can examine it empirically, which is one direction of future research.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. So the citizen orientation label is one where I really struggled. So because it's not just about a label, right? As you say, it's about how we make sense of it and how we maybe later apply or use this index or this part of the concept. And I try to explain in the paper that all of these 6 variables, we can somehow relate them to citizens, right? Even this question of, for example, of accountability, that is one variable in there. I say, okay, strong citizen orientation means that citizens, through their representatives in parliament, control what public administration does. That's kind of one way that I made sense of it. And I went through all of these 6 variables to somehow find a way to, bend them to the idea of citizen orientation. I thought of alternatives, and that is actually something that this question came up a lot also in previous presentations and also by the reviewers. But to be honest, like no one could suggest me an alternative that I thought was really superior. Like I'm not fully happy with what I have, but I really couldn't come up with something better. I think fairly good alternative was something like openness, because this dimension captures perhaps openness of the civil service system, also openness to citizen participation, openness to maybe managerialism rather than a legalistic, more closed view. But then there are some variables where I felt openness didn't really fit so well. So politicization, yes or no? How do you link that to openness? So that was an alternative I considered, but ultimately I stick to this one, but I'm not entirely it's not perfect, let's say.
Yeah.
The other question that or maybe you have another suggestion. I don't know.
Well, I think I would go on following your study, and after hearing your study, I would go for something. If we are speaking about administrative tradition, we should look at two dimensions, structure and strategy. And strategy is more flexible, but then the measures that I would take for strategy would be more managerial and so on, and then do the hierarchical analysis and see. But
I think strategy could work for a lot of variables, but again, how would it work for questions of accountability? It's because that's not a strategy by the administration so much, right? It's more, there's an institutional element here as well. So I'm not sure. But again, I was
or democratization concepts. To what extent administration is about responsiveness, democratization, and then consumer orientation, and to what extent it's more functional, structure-based, and rule-based, that you started to do that. And
but I mean that goes into one of the directions that I was thinking, that countries that have a stronger, what I call citizen orientation, you could also say it's a kind of democratic quality is definitely linked to that. It's something, but then again, I think that's also linked to this, maybe to the idea of citizen orientation, the role of citizens, the focus on citizens. So these are some of the thoughts I had, but I see that this is still an ongoing discussion. I haven't settled this. And the second question you had was the question on stability over time. So I have one data point per country, per variable. I just have a small range of years, just because some variables are available from 2015 and some from 2019, but it's like one snapshot. So I don't have any continuous data there. And so this is one of the big limitations. I only look at one snapshot, right? And then the question is, well, how is that a tradition? And I say tradition in the sense of a coherent set of characteristics, right? A coherent there's some underlying coherence. A tradition is a way of doing public administration, but then the important question is that of historical change or stability that needs to be tackled. And indeed, one plan I have, and one thing that I'm working on for the case of Estonia, is to track these 10 characteristics back in time. So for the case of Estonia, back to the second independence, actually in like 1991, to see how did they develop over time? Maybe when do we see changes? What are the critical junctures? And do they change or develop, in parallel? Or are there some that change in parallel rather than others? So I try to be, again, systematic, but now expanding it more in the longitudinal dimension.
But even shedding light on the stability of each of the, I think you had 10 more element would add some information.
And I think for even just thinking again of the data sources I used here, some are easily available back in time, but then others aren't. So I couldn't easily do the 10, but maybe even one by one could be interesting, definitely. Yeah.
Because if some of them are not stable, they are dynamic, including them in a tradition, under administrative tradition, doesn't capture what's going on. It's more style. Style you can change more, but also style should be something with kind of continuity, suggests continuity, at least in my way.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that, and I think there's a lot of work still to be done, and work has been done. So there is work again on how administrative systems developed over time, which features are stable, but it's a lot of, again, qualitative cases, and some of them are not that in depth, I would say, on a few countries. So that's what we have, and I try to be a bit complementary there.
Yeah. Any more question, you can come. If not, until you come into the discussion, we have a few more minutes. I saw some of the countries are in the kind of the intersection between the axes. What does it mean? I saw my country, Israel, is just closer there to the intersection. Yeah. What are the implications?
I mean, I would argue that this intersection, or kind of the zero, which means zero on both dimensions, and again, the data are standardized. So it's just the middle of the distribution, basically. So it means that that these countries are not particular in a way. They're not particularly concentrated or deconcentrated or politicized or citizen oriented. But where exactly the zero value is depends also a lot on the sample, actually. So if we had more data for more authoritarian countries, for example, like the scale would shift a bit. So it doesn't really have a specific meaning, I would say. What I find more interesting there is to look at how countries are located compared to each other, right? And again, there is some meaningful clustering of those countries that we would expect to go together, but there's also quite some overlap. Something that also this more qualitative literature or case-based literature doesn't really capture, right? It tells us this tradition is different from that other tradition, but what I see empirically is very often they overlap, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marlene. Thank you so much, all of you. We had a great session, and I'm sure it will be useful for others, for you, for your students. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me and for the discussion.
Thank you.